Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of Inside 340B Report. I'm Ted Slafsky, publisher and CEO of 340B Report, and I'm very pleased to be joined by our editorial team. First, I'm going to introduce Will Newton. Will is our associate editor and also serves as a senior writer. Will, how are you today?
Doing good. Excited for the podcast, Ted.
Excellent, excellent. So I see next in line is Bella. So I will introduce you all to Bella Czajkowski. She's our national correspondent based in New York City. Hello, Bella.
Hi, Ted. Thanks. I'm excited.
Excellent. And last but not least, Shannon Young, another associate editor and senior writer. Hello, how are you, Shannon?
I'm good. I'm digging out in Massachusetts, but happy to be here.
Good, good, good. Is it? Did we get some snow up in the Berkshires?
We did. We got probably about 4 inches so far.
Oh, very good. Very, very exciting. I had spoken to my mother in Providence yesterday, and she said they had gotten a little bit of snow. So glad to hear that there's finally some snow in New England. Let's keep it away from Washington, D.C., where Will and I are based. Okay, great. So with that, we're going to talk about three different topics today in today's episode. These are three big issues that we've been covering in the news, and the 340B stakeholders have been spending a lot of time thinking about these issues. First is the issue of the fact that we have more drug manufacturers attempting to implement 340B rebate models, which is different than how the program has worked in the past. It's always been an upfront discount in the 340B program, with one exception for AIDS drug assistance programs. But that is something that's been heating up, and that will be an interesting topic to discuss. We're also going to talk about the growing number of contract pharmacy restrictions that are occurring with community health centers, and we're going to discuss that matter. And Bella's going to tell us about some of the work that she's been doing. And then finally, we're going to turn to the Republican trifecta in Washington and what that all means for 340B stakeholders. We had a really good webinar earlier this week with over 800 registrants, and Shannon and the team watched and listened to that, and they've also been doing some reporting in that area. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Will. Will, tell us a little bit more about what's going on the rebate front.
Yeah, so this is a really big development in the 340B program right now. So there are currently 4 different manufacturer 340B rebate proposals floating around, and they all vary pretty considerably in terms of what types of providers they apply to, how many drugs they apply to, and sort of how they're being administered. And so the J&J rebate proposal that's been around the longest, as it turns out, is actually the most narrowly focused of all of the rebate proposals out there now. And the 3 manufacturer rebate proposals that we've been made aware of since are actually much more expansive and far-reaching than J&J's proposal. So as people who have been following 340B and the podcast will know, J&J's rebate proposal, which they announced back in August, applied to disproportionate share hospitals only and to 2 of J&J's drugs. That sparked pretty strong outcry from providers, a large bipartisan group of federal lawmakers, and HRSA itself, which threatened significant enforcement actions that ultimately led J&J to withdraw its rebate proposal at the end of September. And then 6 weeks later, J&J sued HRSA to implement that same rebate proposal. Now, shortly after J&J filed that lawsuit, Eli Lilly and Bristol-Myers Squibb each filed separate lawsuits against HRSA in federal court to implement their own separate 340B rebate proposals. So unlike J&J, Lilly and Bristol-Myers Squibb did not actually publicly announce or notify covered entities of plans to implement them, but we do know from the lawsuits that they had been communicating with HRSA about these rebate proposals, and we also know what they have in mind for their rebate proposals based on the lawsuits. And both the Eli Lilly and the Bristol-Myers Squibb rebate proposals would apply to all covered entity types, not just hospitals. And Bristol-Myers Squibb's would apply to one of its drugs. Eli Lilly's would apply to all of its drugs. But really, I think,
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, really, I think the biggest development, though, is the Sanofi rebate, which Sanofi a couple weeks ago actually notified covered entities of plans that they do intend to move forward early next year with a rebate proposal. So they haven't filed a lawsuit. They very much intend to move forward with it, although it is possible, as was the case with J&J, that they could withdraw it. But the Sanofi rebate proposal would apply not just to disproportionate share hospitals like J&J's, but also to critical access hospitals, sole community hospitals, and rural referral centers. And then also it will extend to consolidated health centers. Again, unlike J&J's, which applied to 2 of J&J's drugs, the Sanofi rebate model would apply to 25 of its drugs. And then another really important distinction, I think, comes in sort of the fine print of what types of data Sanofi is going to require covered entities to submit in order to get those rebates. And in addition to the 28 claims and pharmacy and medical data items that Sanofi is requiring covered entities to submit to get the rebate, they're requiring hospitals specifically to submit data for what they refer to as healthcare encounter data, including the diagnosis, sort of the reason for the healthcare visit that's resulting in the prescription, which Sanofi says it will then use to, quote, operationalize HRSA's 1996 patient definition. So this is really significant because it's essentially giving Sanofi the ability to determine which patients are 340B eligible. So that's shifting the regulatory authority away from the US agency responsible for protecting the US healthcare safety net and putting it into the hands of, a French multinational corporation whose responsibility is its shareholders. So obviously some very different incentives there. And I know that one provider advocate described this to me as letting the fox guard the hen house. And I know that a lot of other providers are just really concerned about what these rebate models will mean in terms of their ability to access 340B savings to use to help patients. Now, I should also say that a Sanofi spokesperson told me that the goal of the rebate is to increase integrity in the 340B program and to protect against documented abuses such as duplicate discounts and drug diversion. Also claim that there's been a lot of 340B misuse by hospitals and PBMs and contract pharmacies that Sanofi and the other manufacturers say that these rebate models will address. Providers certainly disagree with that. And so I guess now really the next major domino to fall will be to see if HRSA, much like it did with J&J, is going to threaten to remove Sanofi from the 340B program and revoke its access to the Medicaid and Medicare Part B markets. And if HRSA does do that, which it did with J&J, it'll also be interesting to see if Sanofi then responds by either withdrawing its lawsuit or withdrawing its rebate and or filing a lawsuit against HRSA as J&J did. So that's sort of what we're waiting on there.
Right. And Will, you wrote a piece for today's issue about America's Essential Hospitals, their CEO, Bruce Siegel. They represent safety net hospitals, about 300 urban hospitals, really expressing real concern with Sanofi. In particular, I know they're real concerned with all of the rebate efforts, but tell us a little bit more about what they said and what they urged the administration to do.
Yes, so that letter to HRSA was basically urging HRSA to use every tool in its wheelhouse to block Sanofi's rebate model, and also noting that this hospital group believes that Sanofi's rebate proposal is potentially even more harmful than J&J's. And I think the reason that Sanofi's rebate specifically was the target of this letter, is that Sanofi's rebate right now is the only active one of the four, and that the other three, the companies are not actively telling covered entities they're going to implement them. They're just suing the government in order to be able to implement them. Whereas Sanofi actively right now is saying they are going to implement this rebate. And that letter from America's Essential Hospitals to HRSA basically was arguing that Sanofi's rebate proposal is just an attempt to pad its profits, and that the extensive claims data requirements and rebate model don't really do anything to help advance patient access, and might sort of appear intended to just create more red tape that would ultimately make it harder for providers to actually get the 340B discounts.
Well, speaking about efforts by the drug industry to make it more difficult to access 340B discounts, Bella, you've been doing a lot of work over the last few weeks researching the growing number of drug manufacturers that are placing restrictions on community health centers and other federal grantees. As everyone probably knows, there are 37 drug manufacturers that have placed restrictions on hospitals in the 340B program. But for a while, at least a decent number of manufacturers had not placed the restrictions on the health centers, and that is really changing. Can you tell us a little bit about your research, Bella, and what you found out?
Yeah, Ted, of course. So the story I was working on, I published last week, which came with a new tracker, plugged the new tracker on these contract pharmacy restrictions by entity type. Like Ted mentioned, there are 37 total now. Historically, we saw these restrictions apply mainly to hospitals, but now, little by little, there are more health centers included in them as well. So now we're up to 22 health centers that are included, and 18 of those are manufacturers that have restrictions on all covered entity types. So the story I worked on last week looked at sort of the impact of contract pharmacy savings generated through contract pharmacy use. And I talked with some health centers and some CEOs of health centers, and they talked about what services are suffering as a result of savings losses, and how, especially in the year 2024, they're feeling the effects of those losses. I heard about from a couple sources losses of preventative services like vision, dentistry, of course, like cancer screenings and things like that can become more costly to care for patients and safety net hospitals down the line. And I think, it's important to note there's an Advocates for Community Health report that came out last month in November that said or found that FQHCs account for only around 5% of 340B drug purchases in 2023, or they did account for that many. But the impression I got from talking with health centers and representative for health centers is that those funds, although a small piece of the pie, are very, very impactful and essential to the centers.
Yeah, no, I definitely, when I talk to health center executives, the 340B program is absolutely vital to their bottom line. And in fact, from your story, Bella, it looks like there are layoffs going on now at a number of health centers.
Yeah, so I talked with CEO in Ohio, from where my home state is. Actually, I've had the opportunity to visit the county in Southeast Ohio, or the counties covered by this health center. And it's called Hopewell. It made the news a while back for having to lay off about 4% of its workforce and close one of its facilities, which was a youth mental health facility. And the administration at the health center directly attribute this to savings losses from the 340B program due to contract pharmacy restrictions, especially being in a rural area where patients have, I heard in some cases to drive 60 miles to access their medications. So that health center CEO impressed that he's hoping, and he has a sense from others, from colleagues at other health centers, that they're hoping for legislation to come about that sort of halts these restrictions so that the savings losses don't continue.
Yeah, that seems to be a real theme, and it'd be interesting to see if that means there'll be more of a chance for congressional action since the health centers are now really getting hit by these restrictions. I'd like to take a moment to thank our Ultra Diamond sponsors for helping to make this podcast possible. Our 2024 Ultra Diamond sponsors are AIDS Healthcare Foundation, the Alinea Group, Avita Care Solutions, Maxor, RX Paradigm, RX Strategies, and Verity Solutions. You will be learning more about our Ultra Diamond sponsors in the future, but I wanted to make sure to thank them for their leadership role in supporting 340B Report. Let's segue over to Shannon. Shannon, I know you've been covering what's going on in Capitol Hill and the administration, and I know you followed our webinar on Tuesday closely. And first of all, tell us a little bit about the webinar that occurred on Tuesday, and then tell us some of your findings.
Yeah, so as Ted mentioned earlier in the conversation here, 340B Report hosted a webinar that focused on the aftermath of the 2024 elections and what that could mean for the 340B program. So Ted hosted the conversation. He spoke with Amanda Smith, who's counsel for law firm K&L Gates. He spoke with Peggy Teig, who's a principal at the law firm Powers, and she's also counsel for Ryan White Clinics for 340B Access, which represent HIV and AIDS clinics. And then we also spoke with Josh Trent, who's a managing principal at Levitt Partners, and he's also an advisor for the 340B Working Table, which is the group working on the Sustained 340B Act in the Senate. And so the conversation was pretty wide-ranging, touched on a lot of things that we've discussed here, things we've covered, but the gist was sort of looking at now that the dust has settled after the election, what's next, what can we expect? And as we've discussed before, there's a lot of question marks there. Josh made some interesting points about the future of the Sustained 340B Act, which everybody's still anxiously awaiting to see drop in Congress. It looks like at this point, there's still an effort to unveil a final draft of the bill before this Congress adjourns on December 20th, but we're not probably going to see anything happen on that until next session, which starts January 3rd. And as Ted mentioned earlier, when the new Congress begins, we're going to have a Republican-controlled Senate, a Republican-controlled House, and a Republican in the White House. And so why Republicans and GOP leaders initially were touting this and really excited. It looks like things are going to be a little bit tighter and a little bit more difficult to pass partisan bills in Congress than initially thought. This week, we had the final race call in the House, and Republicans have 220 seats, which is more than the 218 magic number you need to have the majority. But that comes with a big asterisk because we've had Matt Gaetz resign his seat after he was nominated to be Attorney General and then later dropped that bid. So his seat's going to be up for a special election. Then we also have the President-elect Donald Trump electing Elise Stefanik in New York to be UN ambassador, and then another congressman from Florida to serve in the administration. And so we're going to see about 217 seats once Congress starts and once Stefanik's confirmation goes through, as the other position doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate. So for the first probably 3-4 months of the new Congress, Republicans are just going to have one seat really to play with here, because if one Republican falls out of party line, then you're looking at a 216 split. And unlike the Senate, where the vice president gets to cast the deciding vote, the House doesn't have such a mechanism. So if there's a tie, the issue just dies. So that sort of sets up an interesting scenario here where you're going to have Republicans in control, but they're going to have to work with Democrats just to deal with factions in their own party if they arise. So it could be a blessing for bipartisan-backed efforts because they're going to need Democratic buy-in to move bills. And with the Senate also having sort of tight margins, it's a little bit bigger than the House. I think it's about 6 seats. There's a little bit more room to play with there, but even still, you're going to need Democrat buy-in probably to move any bills in Congress, at least until 2026.
Yeah, that's right. And Shannon, in fact, I read actually in the Wall Street Journal editorial that it's the slimmest margin in a century. So that is going to be really tough for Speaker Johnson to get things across. And I would say from a former 340B advocate here, that's positive news for the 340B community because well, there's strong bipartisan support for the 340B program. Generally, those who are skeptical about the program are on the Republican side of the aisle. And so that will make it harder for them to pass anything that would be dramatically that would dramatically change the 340B program. Let's talk a little bit about the Senate, and then let's then go move into the administration.
Yeah, so as we've discussed before on here in the Senate, it's going to be Republicans are in control. There is going to be a narrow margin for Republican control, but exciting for 340B advocates. You have John Thune, who is a very outspoken proponent of the 340B program, who's going to take over for Mitch McConnell as majority leader. That means he has the power to set the agenda for the floor, to elevate bills, to make priorities. He's the number one lawmaker in the Senate, so that's a big boost. He's part of the gang of six working on the Sustain Act, but with his new role, it's kind of expected that he might drop off of that. I think Josh Trent talked about that in the webinar this week. It's pretty typical that leaders don't introduce a ton of bills, they don't promote a ton of single issues, so that's nothing uncommon. But the fact that he has been such a big proponent of 340B in the past is a welcome sign for the provider community. Then we also have Bill Cassidy, who is the opposite end of that. He's going to become the chair of the Help Committee, which oversees the 340B program and related bills in the Senate. He takes over for Bernie Sanders, who has been sort of more focused on reining in the drug industry. Bill Cassidy's been running investigations, looking at 340B hospitals, how they use their program savings. He sent out letters to drug makers that have drawn some scrutiny from providers. And so he's kind of expected to maybe beef up his investigations into the program, make a little bit more noise and scrutiny about it. So, in the Senate, it seems like the advocacy community is going to get some good and bad news.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. That dichotomy is quite striking between the leader of the Senate being a big proponent of the 340B program and 340B hospitals, and Senator Thune, who I've known for a long time, and I know he's really a big fan of the program and has been a great supporter of the hospitals and health centers in South Dakota. And then Senator Cassidy, who has some significant skepticism, particularly about hospital use of the program, but has also written letters to health centers, contract pharmacies, and other stakeholders. So I anticipate that there will be a expansion of that investigation now that it will be Chairman Cassidy will have the gavel and the ability to subpoena those who he's investigating, and that usually results in people responding and answering questions.
Yeah, and then I guess related to that, I also wonder if the investigations Cassidy's already done are sort of precursors for his own legislation that might sort of be an alternative to the Sustain Act, because it did sort of seem like from the questioning, I know Bella's done some reporting on this as well, that he was sort of laying the groundwork so he can then say this legislation is addressing concerns that we discovered from doing these inquiries to all of the major stakeholders. So I agree, it's totally possible that he'll continue and expand these investigations. It's also, could just be, him introducing his own legislation as well.
Yeah, I from my experience, being in Washington for the last 30 plus years and seeing all of these various senators at work, I think Senator Cassidy will definitely want to look more closely at the 340B program and will use his perch at the Senate Help Committee to raise a lot of questions about the program. I expect we'll see hearings. I expect that we will get legislation. And I think you're right, Will. We'll probably have two different bills, one that is the bipartisan bill and one that is, there'll be more than, there'll be three bills, probably one that will be mostly Democratic and that will be largely focused on just restoring discounts to the providers through the contract pharmacy program. Then we'll get a bipartisan bill that will have some positive elements for the providers, but they'll also have to have some elements that will be what they described as onerous new requirements. And then we'll have another bill that will be more friendly to the drug industry. So that's going to be really fascinating to watch that play out. Tell us a little bit before we wrap up, Shannon, about the administration and where we think they're going to be headed on 340B.
Yeah, so again, there's some big question marks when it comes to how exactly the incoming Trump administration is going to approach 340B. We're still filling in cabinet positions, but so far we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the HHS Secretary nominee. He's kind of a controversial pick. He has no formal training as a physician or in medicine, but he has gained a lot of attention and at times notoriety for his views on vaccinations and other public health issues. He's seen sort of as a maybe of being confirmed in the Senate. It's unclear. Senators have been kind of tight-lipped about how they see his nomination. But we had recently Scott Gottlieb, who was in the first Trump administration as the FDA director, telling CNBC recently that if he is confirmed and he follows through on his intentions, that he will cost lives in the country. And that's kind of a stinging indictment from somebody who was already part of Trump's cabinet on healthcare. And so that's going to be interesting to see how he approaches the program. He and pharma have been in conflict over the years, so he's not really seen as somebody who is going to cozy up to the drug industry, which could be welcome to 340B providers, but then he's kind of hard to nail down on the subject. He hasn't spoken a lot about 340B. It's unclear exactly how they would approach this. It also wasn't really a huge focus during Trump's first administration, so we'll see there. And then the other cabinet post related to this that we have is Mehmet Oz, who's better known as Dr. Oz, and he is Trump's pick for CMS administrator. Now, this position would have an indirect role on the 340B program because he would just be overseeing Medicaid and Medicare. So where he would come in would be, anything to do with Part B, Part D drug negotiations for Medicare and any sort of Medicaid policy that touches on 340B program. And so, like RFK Jr., he hasn't really had a ton of positions publicly on 340B, which, isn't surprising. He ran for Senate a few years ago in Pennsylvania. So it wasn't really a huge focus of his campaign then, but he has talked a little bit about his support for Medicare Advantage. And, we expect maybe the Trump administration could continue some of the cuts it pursued the first time around to Medicare Part B, which the Supreme Court later reinstated. And then in terms of other picks, we're still waiting. We haven't had anyone yet named for HRSA administrator, which would have sort of the most direct role over the 340B program. And then also there's just a ton of sort of like interagency positions, which I know Ted probably has some more insights on, but before we go there, I just want to, re-up what Will mentioned earlier, that, all these cabinet positions are being decided in the context of this rebate model, and the HHS secretary has a big role to play in that. And so whoever ends up in this position could really have a big impact on the program moving forward. And so, Ted, if you want to talk a little bit about, what you've seen over the years when it comes to these cabinet posts, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So the HHS secretary, of course, is enormously important. Secretary Azar, who was a senior Eli Lilly executive, led the Trump administration's efforts on 340B in the previous administration, and generally was not a fan of the program and made life a little bit tough, to say the least, for the providers in the program. RFK is we really don't know where he stands on these issues and whether he's actually going to get approved. But we also, the Hearst administrator, which will be appointed usually by the HHS secretary, is the person who, and that doesn't require doesn't require Senate confirmation. That will be the person who will have a lot of power over 340B. However, you bring up a good point, Shannon. A lot of this work is done behind the scenes by career individuals. For instance, the current Office of Pharmacy Affairs Director, Chantel Brinton, she is a career public servant. So is her boss, who is very involved with 340B, Commander Krista Pedley, who's been there for many years, and those folks don't leave. And so they will have a strong position. One would think they will continue to oppose these efforts to change the program into a rebate model, and perhaps that will be some solace for the provider community as we move forward. So those are all interesting topics. I know that we are starting to run a little late. We're at the 30-minute mark. But I do want to thank everyone for our team for all your good work and for your contributions. And I encourage you to continue to follow us both at 340B Report, but also listen to our podcast. We will have one more episode prior to the end of the year. And then we will have a great year in 2025. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for participating, and I look forward to talking to all of you very soon. Take care. 340B Report is your indispensable source for news and intelligence on the 340B program. We are pleased to offer a special discount of 25% off for first-time subscribers. Go to the subscribe tab at 340breport.com and use coupon code podcast25. I know you will find our news service to be a valuable investment. Thank you.